Meanwhile, back over at Marvel in the early 80s, in 1982, Marvel released their first limited series. Now remember, they're not going to use the term miniseries because that's what DC calls them. Kind of the way that DC eventually winds up calling their superheroes meta-humans instead of superheroes because the term superhero had been associated with Marvel characters for so long. Anyway, it was a three-part series called Contest of Champions, actually Marvel Superhero Contest of Champions, that was not direct sales only. It was also available in spinner racks and at newsstands. So this was, in addition to being the first limited series, it was also the first company-wide crossover, which, yeah, certainly not the last. So essentially the plot here is pretty thin. It's these two alien brothers, these extremely powerful aliens called the Grand Master and the Collector, who are engaged in a game with one another. And these were not new characters. They'd both been around since the 1960s. They were old Avengers villains. And so to play their game, they basically kidnap all the superheroes on Earth and divide them up into teams and have them compete with one another. And they actually, Marvel made up a few new superheroes for this to represent other countries. So they're all divided up into teams and, playing these games for the benefit of the Grandmaster and the Collector. And, that's basically the same sort of thing that in 1976 on TV cartoons, the Hanna-Barbera characters, Laugh Olympics. And then they also used to have this thing in the 70s called Battle of the Network Stars. It was that kind of idea. And like I said, the plot was pretty thin. Now, the story was written by Mark Gruenwald, and we'll be talking actually more about all three of these guys pretty soon. So I thought I might as well go ahead and introduce you to them. Mark Gruenwald, who died young in 1996. He was just in his 40s of a heart attack. He had a congenital heart defect. But he was a very prominent Marvel writer in the 80s, writer and editor. And then the art was by the art team of John Romita Jr. at pencils. And this is the son of the John Romita, who has been Marvel's art director at this point since the 1960s. And inker Bob Layton. John Romita Jr., or J.R. Jr., as he was often referred to. Romita Jr. and Bob Layton were one of the star art teams, penciler and inker duos that had actually been working together on Iron Man since the late 70s at this time, and that's what they would be most closely associated with. Now, just in case you are familiar with the Marvel movies, even if not necessarily with the comic books, when I talk about the two cosmic brothers, the Grandmaster and the Collector, I'm talking about these guys. All right. Well, that miniseries came out in June of 1982. Ran for 3 issues, June, July, August. It was the first, and it was, it was okay, I guess. Immediately after it was finished, Marvel went right into their next limited series, starting in September 1982. And this one was very different. It was called Wolverine. Now, the character Wolverine had become extraordinarily popular over the previous couple of years, from the time that the X-Men exploded seemingly overnight into popularity. He had never had a solo book or solo adventures. He was always part of that team. So this is Solo Adventures of Wolverine in Japan. Now, this is done by writer Chris Claremont, who had been doing Uncanny X-Men since almost the very beginning of the new X-Men, and Frank Miller, who in 1982, He is at the top of his game over on Daredevil. So Claremont was the closest thing to a superstar writer, if there was such a thing, and Miller was definitely one of the superstar artists in the comics world. And remember, about a year after this, Miller's going to wind up doing a samurai themed limited series, miniseries at DC called Ronin. So this, different from Contest of the Champions, this is serious stuff. This is very grown-up stuff. Wolverine gets kind of cranky, with his claws, and it's a complex story, and it was very, very successful. And in addition to that, the very first page of this limited series would become an iconic image, and maybe even more so, an iconic quote. As I mentioned earlier, in the early 80s, John Byrne took over as both writer and penciler for the Fantastic Four, which had declined significantly in sales and popularity over the previous decade. And when Byrne came over, because of his immense popularity and because of his very good writing and artwork on the series, it once more found its way into one of the top-selling Marvel books in the early 80s. And often this has been referred to as a second golden age of the Fantastic Four. At the same time, he was working on another project of his. Remember, John Byrne's Canadian. Now, he didn't invent Wolverine, the Canadian superhero, but he did become closely associated with him. And, that work on the X-Men is what made Byrne famous. And while he was on the X-Men with writer Chris Claremont, they had co-created a whole team of Canadian superheroes called Alpha Flight. 1983, they got their own title, with Byrne as both writer and penciler on that. Some interesting things were happening with Iron Man in the early 80s. Now, I mentioned John Romita Jr. and Bob Layton. This is right here is where this is during their tenure, which lasted for several years from the late 70s to about 82 or 83. And their style meshed together really well and made both Iron Man and, in this case, Doctor Doom look like they were, in gleaming metallic suits. But Iron Man may have continued to be metallic, but he wasn't so gleaming in starting about 1983. And this was under a different art team by then. But remember when we talked about that storyline in the late 70s where Tony Stark realizes he's alcoholic? I kind of pointed forward to this then. He falls off the wagon really hard and basically is drunk for about 2 years. He loses his company, he loses his home and everything else, and becomes homeless out on the street, and is replaced as Iron Man by his best friend and pilot, James Rhodes, or Rhodey. So you have an African American Iron Man there for a couple of years, though the general public doesn't know that because they can't see his face, right? And eventually Tony Stark sobers up and reassumes the mantle of Iron Man, and Rhodey will eventually become known with his own suit of armor as War Machine. Also during this time, there was a famous run on the series Thor by Walt Simonson as both writer and penciler, and his work was, his style is very unique and very, very beautifully rendered usually. And his writing, well, he was willing to go some places that most people hadn't gone. A lot of a very strong fantasy element. It felt more like a fantasy or sword and sorcery book than a superhero book. And among other things, At one point, there was an entire issue where Loki had turned Thor into a frog. And there was also a new character introduced named Beta Ray Bill, who was an alien who was worthy and was actually able to pick up the hammer of Thor and get Thor-like powers. And eventually, Odin just gave him his own hammer. So that Walt Simonson run probably is regarded as the best run on Thor since Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. There was an expansion of the Avengers in 1984, and this ran for several years, almost a decade, the West Coast Avengers. So Avengers Mansion, located in New York City, basically a sort of a satellite branch of the Avengers is set up out in California, in Los Angeles, with Iron Man and Hawkeye and Henry Pym, Mockingbird, Wonder Man holding Tigra there, and Moon Knight behind them, and several other members that kind of cycled in and out. One of the biggest events of the 1980s, though, was the marriage of Peter Parker, the wedding of Spider-Man. Finally marries Mary Jane Watson. And this was controversial. It was controversial behind the scenes because a lot of people, particularly people who were in charge, pointed back to that basically that philosophy that Stan Lee had articulated back in the late 60s of giving readers the illusion of change without ever actually changing anything. Well, marrying Peter Parker is going to change stuff. As one person put it at the time, you know, what's going to happen now to this character is he's never going to be single again, even if we kill off Mary Jane, then he'll be a widower. Or if they break up, then he'll be a divorcee. And, you know, the whole kind of conceit of Spider-Man was he's this young guy. And these arguments probably would have carried the day if not for the fact that the person who was really pushing for this wedding was actually Stan Lee, who had no longer been doing the comic book end of the business for about 15 years, but who had, along with John Romita, who had been his artist after Steve Ditko back in the 60s, Stan Lee and John Romita had a long-running daily comic strip in the newspapers of Spider-Man, and Stan Lee had decided that the story arc required Peter Parker to be married, and if he's married in the comic books, he should be married. I mean, if he's married in the newspaper comic strips, he should be married in the comics. So they do actually get married. An Amazing Spider-Man Annual number 21 in 1986, and this would change the status quo for about 20 years, at which case there's going to be another major change we'll be talking about much later. But so far as I can tell, fans overall didn't seem to mind this. I mean, it actually felt like Peter Parker moving into a new phase of his life, and it brought a whole new dynamic to the storytelling, and it seemed to be working pretty well. Well, a great big old spider wedding was just one of the big doings at Marvel in 1986. For the other big thing, or the planned big thing, we got to step back a couple of years. Now, remember, just a few minutes ago, I talked about how Jim Shooter had called Doug Moench in and told him that he wanted to kill off Shang-Chi and replace him as the master of Kung Fu with a ninja, and that he had also been talking about killing off the entire cast of Thor. And that was in that same conversation with Doug Moench. He also told Doug Moench Moon Knight is next. That was Moench's other book that he worked on. Well, all of that wasn't just random. Shooter really wanted to put his personal imprint on the Marvel universe, right? This whole thing that had been gotten rolling by Stan Lee and his artist co-creators. Jim Shooter wanted to make it his own, and he was going to do that with this event, a big event that he called the Big Bang. And this Big Bang was going to result in the deaths of all the major Marvel superheroes and their replacements with someone new. Now, this doesn't mean there'd be no more Captain America. This means Steve Rogers would be killed and someone else would become Captain America. Peter Parker would be killed and someone else would become Spider-Man. Well, Mitch immediately made an appointment with Dick Giordano over at DC and went over there and got a job. And there was a threat that a lot of other people were going to do that as well. So Shooter backed off of that idea. But he still wanted to have a great, big, huge event that would seal his legacy in the Marvel universe. And he came up with such an event that could be done without tinkering with the Marvel superheroes, and that was the creation of a whole new universe, which was slated for 1986. 1986 was the 25th anniversary of the first issue of Fantastic Four, which was officially the start of the Marvel Universe. So on that 25th anniversary, there's going to be a new universe that is completely unconnected with the Marvel Universe. So there was this event called the White Event, in which this asteroid like explodes in space, and there's this great big huge lightning crack in the sky, and from that point forward, on this parallel universe, this parallel Earth, I think the number was 2 out of every 1 million people were mutated and became paranormals with superpowers. So this is going to be kind of like, the Earth 1, Earth 2, Earth 3 stuff that was going on still at that time at DC, except there wasn't going to be any breaching of the universes. There's no Spider-Man, there's no Captain America. And this new universe is going to be more realistic. It's not going to have magic. It's not going to have mythological gods. It's not going to have high-tech futuristic stuff. It's not going to have hidden races. It's going to be normal people dealing with being superheroes. So this was heavily promoted all through the year. And then finally that culminated in the release of 9 new titles coming under this new universe brand, which there were a couple of issues, a couple of problems. One was that right around this time, Cadence Industries sort of let it slip that they were thinking about selling Marvel. And that caused some fluctuation economically, and so then they were cutting back on budget, and so a lot of the budget that Jim Shooter had allocated for this project got taken away, and so he wasn't able to get all the big name people that he wanted to work on it. That was one problem. The bigger problem was nobody gave a crap. No one particularly cared about this stuff if it was totally unconnected with anything else. I tried a few of them out. I wasn't particularly that excited about it myself, and I wasn't particularly that impressed, and apparently I wasn't the only one, because by the end of that first year, 4 of the 9 titles had already been canceled, and within a couple of years, they were all canceled. So that's a big blow for the Shooter ego. Now, another thing that's being done during Shooter's tenure is remember Epic Illustrated, the high quality magazine that came out, which that was when Shooter was in charge. That was expanded in 1982 to a whole imprint of Marvel. This one also not connected to the Marvel Universe, although I say also, but the new universe thing hadn't happened yet. These are all just individual comics that our creator owned that are going to be under this more kind of the approach is that this is more high quality, highbrow stuff than just your typical superhero comics. And it included a couple of titles that we've already talked about. Dreadstar by Jim Starlin and Coyote by Steve Englehart. Now, Coyote had already been published, the character, in Eclipse Comics, but Englehart owns the character, so he just brought it from Eclipse to Epic. Dreadstar had appeared, Dreadstar stories had appeared in Epic Illustrated, and so this was his first regular series. Jim Starlin, who owned the character, later took Dreadstar from Epic and took it over to Malibu Comics. And there were many other titles that came out. Most of them in the 80s, but it was still continuing as a line into the 90s. One of the early ones, right there in the middle, Void Indigo by Steve Berger, was canceled really quickly because it was just so incredibly violent. And as you can see in the far right, that's from the 90s. Yes, William Shatner got involved with the advent of a title from Epic that was based on William Shatner's Tech World novels that he was writing in the 1990s. And when I say he was writing, I mean his ghostwriter was writing in the 1990s. As you can see, this is issue 24. It lasted a surprisingly long time. Also from Epic Comics, from that imprint in 1988, this is something that would be very significant. The American release of the Japanese manga by Katsuhiro Otomo, Akira, which at the same time, it had been published as a manga since the early 80s. That same year, it had been made into a feature-length film, which was released also in the United States. So those two things kind of fed off of each other. I mean, if you were paying attention, you were seeing ads and movie posters for this film, and then you're also finding out, hey, the manga has been translated into English and is being made available. So this was, for many, many Americans of that generation, their first exposure to anime, unless they had watched Speed Racer reruns, and to manga. And Akira was one of the first, not the very first, but one of the first Japanese manga to be translated into English. It was the first to be translated in its entirety. So there were, I think, 38 volumes of this that covered all of the Japanese editions from the 1980s. And it was the first one from a major publisher. The couple that had come out before were things that got very limited release, even though they got some critical attention. This made manga appear on the radar of American pop culture. And therefore, I think, in a lot of ways, it may have been the most significant thing to happen in American comics in the 1980s. Now, it would have happened eventually. Someone would have, at some point, finally translated some of these things and made them available. This happened to be the first, though. And within a short time, other manga, such as Lone Wolf and Cub, started to be translated into English and released in comic shops in the U.S. And in fact, I think Lone Wolf and Cub started to be released later this year, maybe 1989. Well, even though John Byrne had left the title, the Uncanny X-Men was still selling like crazy. Like we said before, it was Marvel's #1 best-selling title for 17 years straight. Now, Chris Claremont stuck with it through the entire decade and into the 90s, and then came back again later. Anyway, you had the Uncanny X-Men, who were the new X-Men, right? The original X-Men, the 5 from back in the 60s, we've talked about. They get brought back in 1986, and there's one slight problem with that, is that one of the 5 was Jean Grey, alias Marvel Girl, who had died, in fact, at Jim Shooter's command. So how are they going to get her back? I won't tell you how they did it, largely because just the very act of explaining it would just numb my mind because it was ridiculous. But they did. They brought her back. And so the 5 original X-Men now have their own new team called X Factor. So by January 1987, we've got the Uncanny X-Men, which is at issue 213, the New Mutants, who is the new wave of teenagers being trained. And that had been around for several years, since 1982. And now you've also got X Factor. You've also got another title, fourth title, Classic X-Men, which reprinted older issues. It didn't reprint the issues from the 60s. It reprinted starting with the first appearance of the new X-Men in 1975. So these stories are about 10 years behind what's actually coming out new. But each issue of that one had about a 5 or 6 page extra story that gave you extra history and background about one of the characters. Point is, Uncanny X-Men is the best-selling title Marvel's got, and now they got a bunch of other X titles. By the way, 1991, the New Mutants gets replaced by X-Force, but they'll still have 4 titles, then they'll have 5. We'll get to that. Anyway, now that there are so many different mutant books to deal with, it is possible to do mutant crossover X-Men storylines. The first one in 1986, the Mutant Massacre, mostly took place in Uncanny X-Men, but also played out in New Mutants. But the other 2 that happened, the big ones in the 80s, involved all of the X titles. You had the Fall of the Mutants in 1988. You had Inferno in 1989. Throughout the 90s, there's going to be plenty more. In fact, notice they took a year off, 1987, I guess, to see how it worked. But then, the next 2 years in a row, they've got a big crossover event. It's multi-issue, right? So it's like 4 or 5 months this would be going on. And if you want the whole story, you have to buy all 3 titles for those 4 or 5 months. Later, all 4 titles. And this eventually started to become an annual thing. Every year there was a huge, big thing that required all the mutants to get out there and run around for what ultimately would amount to 1/3 to 1/2 of the year. So that's about half of the time, really. 1989, this was expanded into a major crossover event that involved practically all the superhero titles of Marvel. Acts of Vengeance. And this image I have here is from the Marvel trading cards. It's one of the famous battles. Acts of Vengeance. In this storyline, Loki, Thor's ne'er-do-well brother, gathers together a bunch of other supervillains and basically says, hey, we keep getting defeated by our arch enemies. How about we trade arch enemies? Because they won't be expecting that. It's kind of like Strangers on a Train, which was the suspense novel and Alfred Hitchcock movie where 2 strangers who each want to kill somebody decide to kill the other one's person so they can get away with it. Anyway, this was a multi-part thing that involved practically everybody, so that made this one pretty significant. But you got to go back in time a little bit to look at the one that had started all this, that got the ball rolling on these huge multi-issue massive crossover events. And we're talking about Marvel Superheroes Secret Wars, or just Secret Wars, which is how it's usually referred to. Not Contest of Champions. That was the first limited series. It was only 3 issues long, and it didn't cross over into anything else. You could get the whole story by reading those 3 issues. Not so with this event, because it affected practically the entire Marvel Universe, at least in New York City, right? Didn't affect Conan the Barbarian too much. Not at all. But everybody else, essentially. So here's the storyline in a nutshell. This mysterious alien being called the Beyonder is fascinated by human behavior and all these moral concepts like good and evil. So he kidnaps a bunch of superheroes and a bunch of supervillains and plops them down on this planet together, an uninhabited planet. Now, it's not like Contest of Champions when all the superheroes were kidnapped. In this case, it is the Avengers, the X-Men, the Fantastic Four, Spider-Man, and the Hulk. If I were Daredevil, I would have been really offended by this whole thing, because they just left him holding the bag back in New York City. So all these folks just poof, disappear at the end of each of their respective books. And then this miniseries starts. And then the next month, poof, they all show back up back in New York, but none of them really want to talk about what happened. So you got to continue buying Secret Wars for the rest of the year to find out what ultimately happened. But there were some immediate changes, like the fact that when Spider-Man poofed back to Earth, he was wearing a completely different costume. Now, in the Secret Wars, when they were involved in one of the fights, his old costume got kind of ripped up, so the Beyonder guy gave him a new costume, darker and more mysterious, and incidentally alive. It responded to his thoughts and could flow onto him and even make itself look like other clothing, sort of as camouflage. Now, this didn't go over real well because it's a totally different look, right, for Spider-Man. So they tried to make it stick. They tried to make it stick for about a year. And then there were so many fans saying, where's our familiar looking Spider-Man? And then so many like casual fans or even non-fans not even recognizing who this guy is, right? Because they're used to seeing Spider-Man. So they started sometimes having him wear one outfit and sometimes having him wear the other one, until finally he went to the old red and blue outfit, at which time the new black outfit, which was alive, got jealous and started trying to kill him and became Venom. So it's a lot like the 1980s Cola Wars with Coke, New Coke, and Pepsi, but with murder. Well, there was a story behind the story. A story behind the story of Secret Wars. And it started with the toy company Kenner, who had released a series of DC superhero action figures called the Superpowers Collection, essentially the Justice League. Okay, Jim Shooter, remember, he was really focusing on merchandising, marketing, appealing to kids. He wanted a deal too, and so Marvel was able to get a deal with Mattel for this new line of superhero action figures. Well, can't call it superpowers, obviously, that's taken, but they gotta have a name for it, something catchy. And Shooter was involved in this process. Basically, he was like, kids love Star Wars. Let's call it something or other Wars. Kids love secrets. They love the word secret. Let's call it Secret Wars. And so they did. Now, after I describe the plot of the limited series, you might find yourself asking, why is it called Secret Wars? It seems like there's only one war. And how is it even a secret? Doesn't seem like a secret at all. How does the title make sense? In fact, how does the story make sense? And there were people at Marvel in the creative department who were asking those very questions. And famously, Jim Shooter had a response for them. so far as why don't the stories make sense. These comics, he said, are to teach the kids how to play with the toys. So nothing about a character arc, nothing about a story arc, nothing about plot, um, nothing about themes or mood. It's all about getting kids to buy the toys. That was the only point. Which, remember when I said earlier that some people, fairly or not, have accused Jim Shooter of having really, in a big way, perhaps not introducing, but certainly magnifying the idea that the whole comic book business is really, really just a method to advertise to kids to get them to buy other stuff. Now, there was the following, well, actually, it was 2 years later. This is in '86. There was a sequel to Secret Wars in which the Beyonder decides to come to Earth, and so he makes himself a human body, and he knows nothing about life on Earth, and so he's trying to learn, and he actually shows up in every single comic book that Marvel put out over this 9-month period. And if the first one sounded dumb, I can't even... The first one, in some ways, may have sounded dumb, but it also could be kind of cool. Like who would win between these guys and those guys? But this one, it's like this mysterious alien doesn't know how to use the bathroom, and Spider-Man has to show him. And that was kind of like the high point of the whole thing. It was a huge, colossal disaster, not like the first one, which was very, very financially rewarding for Marvel and actually did help the sales of those toys. But it did more than that because, like I said, it got the ball rolling on these massive, company-wide, multi-issue crossover events. And that changed. That changed superhero, at least, storytelling. Because after a couple of years, as they start doing more of those and then they start doing them regularly, that becomes kind of the whole purpose, the whole be-all and end-all of the storytelling is stumbling from one big crossover to the next without the stories that come in between, without the character development, without the moments in the lives of the characters. So that's why some people point to 1984 as the end of the Bronze Age and the beginning of the Modern Age. Others, like I said, point to 1985 for reasons that we will discuss very soon. Speaking of Secret Wars, remember how I said that Jim Shooter was accused of sometimes having a very high opinion of himself and of rubbing people the wrong way? Well, here is a leaked memo, which, to be fair, Jim Shooter himself says he never wrote, and one of the editors at the time, Elliot Brown, has also said that this was not something that he ever received. But it does sound very consistent with the sort of things that Jim Shooter was saying in memos. So it's either an actual memo that he sent out jokingly, or at least that's what he always said, was he was joking, or it was someone else in the office making a joke imitating Jim Shooter on purpose, with the joke being that everyone would recognize this is the sort of thing that Jim Shooter would say. Several things that he says, basically how he's the ultimate authority on all the characters and likened to the very god of the Marvel Universe, and his work is perfect, and etc., etc. Well, here is a memo that is verifiably real, in which he says, effective immediately, start doing good comics. I realize that this directive reflects a substantial departure from previous company policy, but please try to comply. So whether that first one is actually real or not, it certainly shows the way that Shooter presented himself and the way that other people perceived him. All right, well, 1983, 1984, around that time, as Marvel's share of the market is growing more and more, especially in the direct sales market. There were accusations by some companies that Marvel was intentionally trying to smother them by releasing so many new titles and thereby taking up space on the shelves, edging other companies out. So that was one issue that is going to come to the forefront. But it kind of demonstrates just how far Marvel had come when you consider that in early 1984, Jim Shooter had recommended to the people at Cadence that they just outright offer to buy DC Comics, to buy their characters, showing basically that DC had been consistently losing money with characters that should have potential to make a lot of sales. So he recommended that Marvel license DC's characters, which meant essentially Warner Entertainment would still own the characters and could do all the merchandising and all the movies and all that stuff, but that Marvel would actually be in charge of making the DC comics. And as a result of this, a study was prepared and a report was printed up. Essentially, this is the thing that Shooter had commissioned, a sales analysis of DC's titles showing that all of them were at least 20,000 copies less in sales than they had been previously. This was by the end of the following year. They're still working on this, still thinking about making the offer to buy DC Comics, which at this time, it's hard to say whether that might have actually been something that could have happened. However, there was a fly in the ointment, which goes back to what I was just talking about, the glut in the market. First Comics, which had gone out of business in 1984, sued Marvel, claiming that they had intentionally had a systemized plan that was geared toward creating a monopoly and edging all of the smaller companies completely out of business, and that they had colluded. The charge was that Marvel had colluded with the printing companies to get them to raise their prices on paper, which also would put the smaller companies in danger of going under. Well, this dragged out for a while, and ultimately nothing came of it. But at the time, when Jim Shooter was trying to convince the powers that be to actually try to buy DC, buy the superheroes, and then they're getting accused of creating a monopoly, right? That's not good timing. In fact, I believe that it was a 70% share of the market that was needed to be able to conclusively accuse someone of being a monopoly. And by this point, Marvel was well over 50% of the market, maybe closer to 60%, and DC was at about 20%. So if they had acquired them, that would have put them way over that threshold. So they held back on that. But it is very interesting to think about what might have happened if that had occurred. Well, meanwhile, Jack Kirby has been trying for years and years to get Marvel to return to him his original artwork, his original pencils, of which he had given them over the years about 8,000 pages. And technically the publishing company didn't own the original art. It owned the reproduced image of the original art. So if he had the original art done in pencil, why, all those things at this point, especially from the 1960s, would have been worth a fortune. And to be honest, he needed the money. Well, he was given an offer. Marvel told him, we've been looking around and we found a little bit, so you can have this. And it was 88 pages out of 8,000. And they said that's all they could find. But meanwhile, more and more frequently, those missing pages were showing up at conventions for sale and bringing high prices. Now, where were they coming from and who was selling them? That was very problematic. So, with Neal Adams among those leading the way, about 150 comics professionals signed a petition for Marvel, pressuring them to give Jack Kirby his artwork back, and eventually he got 2,000 pages of it, which is more than 88, but is only about 25% of what they had of his. And somebody, somewhere along the line, was making some money off of that. Now, Jim Shooter was the one calling the shots, and he was the one who was being recalcitrant, who was making these low offers. Hey, well, this is all we can find, 88 pages. This, as much and maybe even more than anything, led toward a lot of industry ill will toward Jim Shooter, because Jack Kirby was a revered figure who most people considered had been treated shabbily and had never gotten his proper due. And now here, essentially, he was being cheated again. So no one's happy with Jim Shooter about that. Well, around this time, Cadence Industries folded. The company, which had been established in, I think, 1962 by Martin Ackerman. Remember that guy? He was kind of a wheeler dealer. It collapsed, and its assets were liquidated and put up for sale. And Marvel Comics, the Marvel Comics part of it, was bought for $48 million, I think, by New World Entertainment, which had begun as New World Pictures but had expanded beyond just movies in 1986. So they have invested a lot of money, $48 million. Of course, if you go forward and imagine how much such a purchase would have been later on, $48 million doesn't sound like much. But they wanted to protect their investment. They wanted things running smoothly. And they wanted a short-term return. They weren't looking toward the long term. 1989, they sold Marvel to the multi-billionaire Ron Perelman, who would be the owner throughout the 1990s. But for the late 80s, they're trying to keep everything running smoothly. They don't like the bad publicity about Jack Kirby. They don't like the fact that this whole new universe thing was a complete failure. And the last straw came when word leaked out about a party at John Byrne's house, a barbecue. A lot of people who worked in the comics industry were there. Now, John Byrne is one of the many people who left Marvel and went to DC. He left the Fantastic Four in 1986, went to DC. So there were people there who worked at Marvel and people there who had once worked at Marvel. And just for fun, they made an effigy of Jim Shooter and set fire to it. They burned him in effigy. This is not a statement of confidence in one's leadership, right? And around that same time, things were happening like in an issue of the DC miniseries Legends, which featured members of the Justice League. They ran into this sort of third-rate attempted villain named Sunspot, who was this really tall guy, drawn by John Byrne, with kind of vaguely familiar features, who kept talking about how powerful he was. From this day forward, I will show you all how power is meant to be used. I will remake this sorry world in my own image. Well, who do we know that's been trying to remake a whole universe in his own image? And then when he's defeated, he says, don't you know who and what I am? I will the ultimate power, the power to create a new universe. It's pretty clear who they're talking about there. So all this stuff just seemed like a bridge too far for the new owners at Marvel. And so 1987, Jim Shooter was fired. He was fired, and Tom DeFalco stepped up to take his place. He would be in charge there for the next 7 years. DeFalco, longtime Marvel writer who had been very active in the 1980s as a writer and then as an editor. Now, under his leadership, Marvel would take another step forward and start having royalties for the editors as well as the artists and writers. But that is the end of the Jim Shooter era, and it's right around just a little bit over the end of the Bronze Age era. So that's what was happening at Marvel. Next, we'll go take a look at what's going on at DC.